The year is 1888. In the heart of the Arizona desert, under a sun that shows no mercy, a lone woman walks. Her name is Mary O'Connell, and every step is a battle. Her belly is swollen with a child soon to enter this world, but her greatest burden is the heavy wooden yoke across her shoulders, the buckets of precious water swinging with each agonizing movement. She is an outcast, a whisper on the dusty streets of the town of Redemption. But what she doesn't know is that her journey across the scorched earth is being watched. A man as powerful and unforgiving as the land itself is about to make her an offer that will either be her salvation or her ruin. The dust of Redemption, Arizona was a living thing. It coated every surface in a fine, gritty film, rose in choking clouds with each passing horse, and settled deep in the lines of Mary O'Connell's face, making her look far older than her 19 years. It was the same color as her despair, a pale, hopeless beige. Her life had been stripped down to a single brutal rhythm, the slosh of water in two heavy buckets and the burn in her shoulders. Every morning before the sun had a chance to bake the sanity from the world, and every evening as it bled across the horizon, Mary made the 2-mile trek to the Verde River. The town well, a muddy pit of last resort, was a place of judgment. The good women of Redemption, wives and daughters of miners and merchants, gathered there, their whispers as sharp as cactus spines. They looked at Mary's swelling belly, a testament to a sin she wore without the dignity of a husband's name, and their eyes were cold. They would make her wait, finding sudden, urgent needs to fill their own barrels, their backs turned to her as if she were a ghost. So Mary walked. She walked to the river where the only judgment came from the buzzards circling overhead. Today the heat was a physical blow. The sun hammered down, and the wooden yoke dug into the raw flesh of her shoulders. She had tried patting it with rags, but they quickly became soaked with sweat and chafed just as badly. Each step sent a jolt of pain through her body. The baby nestled low in her womb felt like a lead weight, pulling her down, down, into the unforgiving earth. She paused, resting the buckets on the ground, and pressed a hand to the small of her back. She closed her eyes, her breath a ragged sob in her throat. It had been a letter, a single flimsy piece of paper from a man named Thomas Rafferty, a railroad man with eyes the color of a summer sky and a voice full of promises as empty as a dry creek bed. He had promised her marriage, a small house in California, a life away from the suffocating piety of her parents. She had believed him. She had given him everything she had, only to receive a letter 6 months later, postmarked from a town she'd never heard of, informing her he had a wife and 3 children in Boston. The letter didn't apologize. It simply stated a fact, as if discussing the weather. Her father, a man whose love was conditional on his daughter's purity, had cast her out. "No daughter of mine will bring this shame upon my house," he had declared, his voice trembling with a fury that was more about his own pride than her pain. Her mother had wept silently, pressing a few dollars into Mary's hand before shutting the door, the click of the lock echoing the final closing of a door on her old life. Now this was her life, a tiny one-room adobe hut at the edge of town that baked like a kiln during the day and was infested with scorpions at night. The few dollars were long gone. The pittance she earned mending clothes for the saloon girls was barely enough for flour and beans. The water, the very essence of life, was the price she paid for her sin, a daily penance performed under the cruel Arizona sun. She hoisted the yoke again, the muscles in her neck and back screaming in protest. The water sloshed, precious drops darkening the thirsty ground. She couldn't afford to waste it. This was for drinking, for cooking, for washing. Every drop was a treasure. As she neared the dusty track that passed for a main street, she saw him. He was a fixture in Redemption, a man who seemed to own the very air everyone else breathed. John Sterling. His ranch, the Sterling Spread, was the largest in the territory, a sprawling empire of cattle and land that stretched as far as the eye could see. He was a man of contrasts, always impeccably dressed in a tailored black coat and fine leather boots. Yet his face was weathered by the sun and wind, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, were calloused and strong. He was leaning against the post of the general store watching her. His eyes, a startlingly intense shade of blue, missed nothing. They followed her slow, painful progress, his expression unreadable. Most men in town either looked through her or at her with a leering contempt. John Sterling just watched. It was unnerving. He never spoke, never offered a greeting. He simply observed, a hawk surveying its domain. Mary lowered her gaze, her cheeks burning with a familiar shame. She hated this walk through town, this parade of her disgrace. She tried to quicken her pace, but the weight of the water and the child within her held her back. She could feel his eyes on her, a physical pressure. She stumbled, a loose rock turning under her worn-out shoe. One of the buckets tipped violently, and a third of its contents splashed into the dust, turning it to instant mud. A cry of pure anguish escaped her lips. Not just for the lost water, but for the lost effort, for the extra trip the searing pain in her back now promised. Tears welled, hot and bitter. She sank to her knees, not caring about the filth or the stares of the few who had witnessed her clumsy failure. It was all too much. The heat, the thirst, the loneliness, the unending, grinding hardship. She buried her face in her hands and finally allowed the sobs to come, her thin shoulders shaking with the force of her despair. She didn't notice the polished boots that had stopped just a few feet away. She didn't hear the quiet, deep voice that cut through her misery until it spoke for the second time. "Ma'am," John Sterling said, his voice not unkind, "that seems like a heavy burden for one person." Mary flinched at the sound of his voice, yanking her hands from her face as if she'd been caught in another transgression. To be seen in such a state, kneeling in the dirt, weeping like a lost child, was a new level of humiliation. And to be seen by him, John Sterling, a man who radiated a power and self-possession so absolute that it made her own wretchedness feel 1,000 times more acute. She scrambled to her feet, wiping furiously at her wet cheeks with the back of a dusty hand, leaving a muddy streak across her skin. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice thick and hoarse. She refused to look at him, focusing instead on the dark, damp patch in the street where her precious water had been swallowed by the dust. The sight of it made her stomach clench with a fresh wave of despair. "Clearly," Sterling replied, a dry note in his voice that was not quite sarcasm, but something more complex. It was observational, a statement of fact. He made no move to help her, but he didn't move away either. He simply stood there, a tall, imposing shadow against the glaring sun. From the corner of her eye, she could see Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, peering out from the draperies of the mercantile, her face a mask of sanctimonious curiosity. The sight of the town's richest man speaking to its most prominent sinner was no doubt the most interesting thing to happen all week. I need to go," Mary stammered, reaching for the yoke. Her hands trembled. She felt weak, exposed, and profoundly foolish. "You'll do yourself an injury," Sterling stated. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a diagnosis. His gaze flickered from the yoke to her swollen belly, then back to her face. There was no pity in his eyes. There was no contempt either. It was a look of frank assessment, the way a man might evaluate a piece of livestock or a parcel of land. It was this unnerving detachment that set him apart from everyone else. "What business is it of yours?" Mary snapped, her fear and shame curdling into a desperate, defensive anger. A flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or even amusement, crossed his features, gone as quickly as it appeared. He took a step closer, and Mary instinctively took a step back. "I own the land the river runs through," he said, his voice low and even. "I own the land your house is built on. I suppose you could say your welfare is, in a small way, my business." The statement hung in the air between them, a stark reminder of her powerlessness. He owned everything, including her misery. The anger drained out of her, replaced by the familiar, weary resignation. "I pay the rent," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "To the penny, every month." How did he know that? She paid the small sum to a clerk in his land office, a weedy man named Peters who always looked down his nose at her. The idea that John Sterling himself, a man who dealt in cattle by the thousand and acres, by the tens of thousands, would be aware of her paltry rent payments was absurd. And yet she knew he was telling the truth. He finally broke his unnerving stillness. He walked over to the two buckets, lifted them as if they weighed nothing, and carried them to the water trough outside the saloon. He emptied the remaining contents with a splash, the horses tied to the rail raising their heads in mild interest. Then he turned, the empty buckets in one hand, the wooden yoke in the other. "Come," he said, not as a request but as a command. He started walking, not towards the river, but in the direction of her small adobe hut. Mary stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. What was happening? What did he want? Every instinct screamed at her to run, but where would she go? He owned the ground beneath her feet. With a sense of dread and a bizarre flicker of curiosity, she followed him, her bare feet padding softly in the thick dust. They walked in silence. The few people they passed stared openly, their jaws slack with astonishment. John Sterling, striding through the dirtiest part of town, carrying water buckets for the fallen woman. It was a scene so surreal it felt like a heat-induced hallucination. When they reached her hut, he placed the buckets and yoke by the door. He didn't look at the cracked adobe walls or the patched-up roof. His gaze was fixed on her. "This is no life for you," he said. Mary's laugh was a harsh, broken sound. "It's the life I've earned." Perhaps, he conceded, his blue eyes seeming to look right through her, into the very core of her shame. "But it is no life for a child." The mention of her baby made her wrap her arms around her stomach protectively. "We will manage." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. Manage how? By starving? By hauling water until she collapsed and the child was born dead in the dust? "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. O'Connell." She flinched at the formal address. No one had called her that in months. "My name is Mary." "I know," he said again, with that same unnerving certainty. "My proposition is this. I need a wife. You need a name for your child and a roof over your head that won't collapse in the next rainstorm. I'm prepared to offer you both." Mary stared at him, convinced the sun had finally addled her wits. The world seemed to tilt and swim before her eyes. The buzzing of the flies, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the pounding of her own heart, it all faded into a roaring in her ears. John Sterling, the cattle king of Arizona, was standing outside her hovel, proposing marriage. It wasn't just absurd, it was insane. "Why?" she finally whispered, the word a puff of air. "Why me?" He looked away for a moment, his gaze sweeping over the barren landscape beyond her hut. When his eyes met hers again, they were shielded, impossible to read. "I have my reasons," he said. "They are my own. They needn't concern you. What should concern you is the offer. My name, the protection of my home. You will want for nothing. Your child will want for nothing. In return, you will perform the duties of a wife. You will run my household. You will be Mrs. John Sterling. That is the arrangement." He spoke of marriage as if it were a business transaction, a cattle deal. There was no mention of affection, of love, of any of the things she had once so foolishly dreamed of with Thomas Rafferty. This was a contract, cold, simple, and utterly bewildering. "People will talk," she said, her mind grasping for reasons, for logic in a situation that had none. "People have always talked," he countered, a corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile. "Let them. Their talk doesn't fill my coffers or fatten my cattle." He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "I will have your answer by sundown tomorrow. If you accept, meet me at the courthouse. If you do not, I suggest you find a stronger yoke." Without another word, he turned and walked away, his long strides eating up the ground, leaving Mary standing in the oppressive heat, the dust settling around her like a shroud. She looked at the empty buckets, at the crude wooden yoke that represented her entire existence, and then at the back of the man who had just offered her the world for a price she couldn't begin to comprehend. The night was a torment. Mary lay on her thin straw mattress, the adobe walls of her hut seeming to close in on her. The scorpions, usually a source of terror, were forgotten. Her mind was a maelstrom, replaying John Sterling's words over and over until they lost all meaning, and then regained it with a terrifying clarity. "I need a wife. You need a name for your child." It was a stark and brutal calculus, yet it was undeniably true. She had nothing. Less than nothing. She had a future of back-breaking labor, of social ostracism for herself and the bastard label for her child. Her baby would be born into a world that would scorn it from its first breath, a world where its mother's only legacy was shame. She pressed a hand to her belly, where a faint flutter answered her touch. This child, this innocent life, deserved more than she could give it. It deserved a name. It deserved a future free from the stain of her past. But marriage to John Sterling, a man she didn't know, a man who spoke of a lifelong union as if it were the hiring of a housekeeper. In return, you will perform the duties of a wife. What did that mean? The phrase hung in the darkness, ominous and vague. It meant sharing a home, a table, a life. It meant sharing a bed. A cold dread washed over her, colder than the sweat on her skin. Could she do that? Could she give herself to this cold, unreadable stranger, even for the sake of her child? The memory of Thomas Rafferty's easy smiles and false promises rose like bile in her throat. She had given her heart and her body out of love, and it had led her to this ruin. Perhaps there was a grim wisdom in Sterling's approach, a marriage built on need, not emotion, a contract with clear terms and no room for the devastating heartbreak of betrayal. It was a loveless bargain, but perhaps a loveless bargain was safer than a love that was a lie. Morning came, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. Mary did not go to the river. The empty bucket sat by the door, a silent testament to the choice before her. She ate the last of her stale bread, her stomach churning with anxiety. She walked to the edge of her small plot of land and looked out toward the vast expanse of the Sterling Ranch, which began where the town's squalor ended. It was a different world out there, a world of wealth and power, of green pastures and fat cattle, a world shielded from the desperation that was her daily bread. Her decision, when it came, was not a surrender. It was an act of war, a war against her own misery, a war for her child's future. She would not be a victim kneeling in the dust. She would become Mrs. John Sterling. She would take his name, his home, his protection, and she would forge a life for her baby, no matter the cost to her own heart. She washed her face with the last of her water. She put on her only other dress, a faded blue calico that was patched but clean. It strained at the seams across her belly. She brushed her long, dark hair until it shone, tying it back with a piece of twine. She had no shoes worthy of a courthouse, so she scrubbed her bare feet as best she could. Looking at her reflection in a shard of broken mirror, she saw a pale, determined woman with haunted eyes. This would have to do. The walk to the center of town was different this time. She kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward. The whispers followed her as always, but today they were laced with a new, frantic energy. The news of yesterday's encounter had spread like wildfire. Mrs. Gable was sweeping the porch of the Mercantile, her broom moving with agitated fury as she watched Mary pass. Two cowboys loafing outside the saloon stopped their crude jokes and stared, nudging each other. She saw him before she reached the courthouse. He was waiting on the steps, dressed in the same impeccable black coat. He wasn't looking at her but at the horizon, as if he had business with the mountains themselves. He held his hat in his hands. As she approached, he turned, and his blue eyes met hers. He didn't smile, but a subtle tension seemed to leave his shoulders. Her arrival was the answer he needed. "Mary," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Mr. Sterling," she replied, her own voice surprisingly steady. "John," he corrected her quietly. "My wife will call me John." The word wife sent another tremor through her, but she did not let it show. Inside the courthouse, the air was cool and smelled of old paper and stale cigar smoke. Judge Miller, a portly man with a face like a worried bloodhound, looked up from his desk. His eyes widened when he saw the two of them. "Sterling," he said, nodding respectfully. He then glanced at Mary, and his expression shifted to one of open, bewildered shock. "And Miss O'Connell?" "She is to be my wife, Judge," John said, his tone leaving no room for questions. "We require your services." The judge swallowed hard, his gaze darting between the powerful rancher and the town's penniless outcast. He clearly thought Sterling had lost his mind, but he was not a man to question him. He fumbled for the correct papers, his hands shaking slightly. He found two men from the land office, including the weaselly Mr. Peters, whose eyes were wide with disbelief, to serve as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and stripped of all sentiment. Judge Miller mumbled the words, his voice devoid of any warmth. Mary stood stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her. When it came time for her to speak, her voice was a whisper. "I do." John's voice, in contrast, was firm and clear. "I do." There was no ring. He had not offered one, and she had not expected it. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, a heavy, awkward silence filled the room. Mr. Peters was staring at her as if she had sprouted a second head. John signed the marriage certificate with a bold, decisive hand. Mary's signature was small and trembling, and then it was done. She was Mary Sterling. The name felt foreign, a costume she was wearing. Outside in the harsh sunlight, John turned to her. "My wagon is at the livery. We'll collect your things." "I have nothing to collect," Mary said, thinking of her miserable hut with its straw mattress and single-chipped plate. There was nothing there she wanted to carry into this new life. He nodded as if he had expected this. "Then we'll go home." He led her to a sturdy buckboard wagon hitched to two strong horses. He helped her up onto the seat, his hand firm on her elbow. It was the first time he had touched her, and her skin tingled at the brief impersonal contact. As they drove out of Redemption, she didn't look back. She felt the weight of the town's collective gaze on her, a mixture of envy, scorn, and utter confusion. Let them stare. Let them whisper. Their world of petty judgments no longer had any power over her. She was Mrs. John Sterling now. She was riding away from the dust and the shame, towards a future as vast and unknown as the sprawling ranch that now bore her name. She stole a glance at the man beside her. His profile was stern, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He was her husband, a stranger, and as the wagon rumbled on, carrying her deeper into his world, she was gripped by a terrifying thought. She had not escaped one prison simply to enter another. The Sterling Ranch was not just a home, it was a kingdom. As the buckboard crested a low rise, the vista that opened before Mary stole her breath. A vast two-story ranch house built of dark timber and river stone stood nestled in a valley that had been tamed into a startling oasis of green. A veritable army of cowboys tended to thousands of cattle that grazed in endless pastures, and a network of corrals, barns, and outbuildings sprawled in every direction. This wasn't a ranch. It was a town unto itself. The house was a fortress of wealth and solitude. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of beeswax and leather. Polished wood floors gleamed under heavy timber beams. A massive stone fireplace dominated the main room, large enough to roast a whole steer. The furniture was dark, masculine, and built to last for centuries. It was the antithesis of her miserable hut, yet it was just as silent. An older Mexican woman with kind, wary eyes and hair in a neat gray bun met them at the door. "This is Carlotta," John said, his tone softening slightly. "She is my housekeeper. Carlotta, this is Mary, my wife." Carlotta's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. She looked from her employer to the pregnant, barefoot girl in the faded calico dress. 1,000 questions flickered in her gaze, but she was a professional. She simply inclined her head. "Senora," she murmured, her voice soft. The title was so formal, so alien, that Mary felt a fresh wave of dislocation. "Show her to the master bedroom," John instructed. "See that she has a bath and clothes." He then turned to Mary. "I have business to attend to. Carlotta will see to your needs. We will dine at 7. And with that, he was gone, his boots echoing on the polished floor before the heavy front door closed behind him, leaving Mary alone with the housekeeper in the vast, silent house. The master bedroom was larger than her entire hut. A huge 4-poster bed, draped in heavy linens, stood against one wall. A wardrobe, a dressing table, and a plush armchair completed the room. French doors opened onto a private veranda that overlooked the entire valley. It was a room fit for a queen, not for her. Carlotta, true to her word, prepared a bath. The steaming, scented water in the copper tub was a luxury Mary hadn't experienced in over a year. As she soaked, scrubbing away the grime and the shame of her old life, she felt a profound sense of unreality. She was an imposter in this gilded cage. Later, Carlotta presented her with a selection of dresses, simple but beautifully made, left behind, she explained vaguely, by a previous visitor. Mary chose a dark green cotton dress that fit loosely over her belly. When she looked in the mirror, she saw a stranger. The clean skin, the decent dress, the opulent surroundings. They were a costume, and she was an actress in a play she didn't understand. Her first encounter with the true heart of the ranch came in the form of a man named Frank Henshaw. He was John's foreman, a man whose face was a roadmap of sun-baked wrinkles and whose eyes were chips of cold, hard granite. He came to the house in the late afternoon, ostensibly to speak with John, but Mary knew he had come to inspect her. She was on the veranda when he arrived, his spurs jingling on the stone flags. He removed his hat, revealing a bald, sun-spotted head. "Ma'am," he grunted, the word sounding like an insult. His gaze was openly hostile, sweeping over her in a way that made her feel dirty again. He looked at her belly with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Henshaw," Mary said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "I've worked for John Sterling for 30 years, he said, his voice a low growl. "Seen him through drought, cattle rustlers, and Apache raids. Always knew his mind. Never saw him do a damn fool thing. Until now." The raw animosity stunned her. "My arrangement with my husband is none of your concern," she replied, her voice shaking slightly. Henshaw spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine lawn. "When it affects the ranch, it's my concern. This ranch runs on respect. The men respect him. They fear him. What do you think they'll say when they see he's married? This," he gestured vaguely at her, encompassing her pregnancy, her poverty, her entire sordid history, which he had no doubt already heard in town. "I am his wife," Mary said, her chin rising. The words felt a little more real this time. "You're a contract," he sneered, "and I'll be waiting for you to break it." He turned on his heel and stomped away, leaving a palpable trail of hatred in his wake. Mary sank into a chair, her hands trembling. She had not considered this. She had thought only of the town's judgment, not of the judgment of the people within her new world. She now had a roof over her head, but she had also made a powerful enemy. That evening, dinner was a silent, formal affair. John sat at the head of a long, polished table, with Mary seated a cavernous distance away at the other end. They ate in complete silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware on porcelain. The food was exquisite. Roast chicken, fresh vegetables from a garden she hadn't known existed, but it tasted like ashes in her mouth. After the meal, John led her into a study lined with books from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, handing one to her. She shook her head. "I have something for you," he said, ignoring her refusal. He opened a drawer in his massive oak desk and took out a small, velvet-lined box. He opened it. Inside, nestled on the dark blue velvet, was a simple, solid gold band. A wedding ring. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice flat. "It is fitting you should have it." He took her left hand. His fingers were surprisingly gentle as he slid the ring onto her finger. It was warm from his touch. The weight of it felt immense, a manacle binding her to him, to this life, forever. "Now it is official," he said, stepping back. He looked at her, his eyes traveling from the ring to her face to her belly. "I expect this to be a quiet, orderly household, Mary. I expect discretion. The child will be raised as a Sterling. It will have my name. No one is to ever speak of its true parentage. Do you understand?" "And what of its true father?" Mary asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. John's face hardened, the brief moment of gentleness vanishing completely. "He does not exist. As of this moment, he is a ghost, a story that is never to be told. Your past is buried, Mary. See that it stays that way." He gestured towards a door on the far side of the study. "That is your room." He then pointed to another door, identical to the first. "This one is mine. They are connected. As I said, I expect you to perform the duties of a wife, but I will not force you, not with the child. After it is born, we will revisit the terms of our arrangement." He downed his brandy in one swallow. Good night, Mary. She was dismissed. He turned his back to her and stared into the fire, a solitary, brooding figure. Mary stood there for a long moment, the cold gold band on her finger, a constant reminder of the bargain she had made. She had a name. She had a home. But as she walked into her luxurious empty bedroom and closed the door, she realized she was more alone than she had ever been in her life. And she had a horrifying suspicion that the ghosts of her past were not nearly as buried as her new husband believed. The weeks bled into one another, each day a mirror of the last. Mary fell into a strange, detached routine. She managed the house with a quiet efficiency that seemed to satisfy John and slowly, grudgingly, earn a sliver of respect from Carlotta. She learned the names of the ranch hands, the rhythms of the seasons, the vast and complex machinery of the Sterling Empire. She ate her meals in silence with her husband, spoke to him only when necessary, and slept alone in her magnificent bedroom, the connecting door to his room remaining resolutely shut. The baby grew, and with it, a strange sense of peace settled over Mary. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a stir of affection for the life within her. Here in this gilded cage, her child would be safe. It would be a Sterling. It would never know the shame of being a nameless bastard. This conviction became her shield, protecting her from the foreman Henshaw's lingering hostility and the suffocating loneliness of her marriage. John remained an enigma. He was a man of tireless energy, rising before dawn and often returning after dark, his days consumed by the endless demands of his ranch. He treated her with a consistent, formal courtesy, but never with warmth. There were moments, however, when she would catch him looking at her, his blue eyes filled with an expression she couldn't decipher. It wasn't desire, and it wasn't contempt. It was something deeper, more complicated, and it vanished the moment she met his gaze. The twist came on a sweltering Tuesday in September. Mary was in the kitchen with Carlotta, preserving peaches, when a ranch hand burst in, his face pale under his tan. "Mr. Sterling," he gasped, looking wildly at Mary. "There's a man at the main gate. He's asking for a Mary O'Connell." The name hit her like a physical blow. The preserving jar slipped from her fingers and shattered on the stone floor, the sticky syrup and bright orange fruit spattering across her dress. O'Connell. No one had called her that since the day she'd signed her name next to John's. "Who is he?" Mary asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Didn't give a name, ma'am," the cowboy stammered. "Just said he was an old friend. From the railroad." The railroad. The world tilted, the kitchen dissolving into a dizzying blur. It couldn't be. He wouldn't dare. Thomas Rafferty. Here. A cold voice cut through her panic. "See to the mess, Carlotta." John was standing in the doorway, his face a thundercloud. He had come in for the midday meal and had heard everything. He looked at Mary, his eyes narrowed to slits. "I will handle this." "No," Mary said, a strength she didn't know she possessed surging through her. "He is asking for me. I will go." This was her ghost, her demon. She had to be the one to face it. John's jaw tightened, but he gave a curt nod. "I will be right behind you." She walked, not ran, towards the main gate, her mind a frantic whirl. What did he want? Money? Trouble? Why now after all this time? As she drew closer, she saw him. He was leaning against the heavy timber gate, looking thinner than she remembered, his clothes shabby, but the eyes were the same, the startling blue of a summer sky, the color that had once made her heart ache with love. "Mary?" Thomas Rafferty said, a slow, familiar smile spreading across his face. It was the smile that had charmed her, the smile that had lied to her. "My God, it is you. I heard a rumor in town, but I didn't believe it. Mrs. John Sterling, you've done well for yourself." "What are you doing here, Thomas?" she asked, her voice flat and cold. "I came looking for you," he said, his smile faltering slightly at her tone. "I made a mistake, Mary. A terrible mistake. I left my wife. It's you I want. It's always been you." He took a step towards her, his eyes falling to her swollen belly. "Our baby," he whispered, his voice thick with a counterfeit emotion. "I came back for our baby." "It is not your baby," a deep voice boomed from behind her. John Sterling stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Mary, a silent, immovable wall of protection. He was not wearing a gun, but he didn't need one. His presence was more intimidating than any weapon. Rafferty's bravado evaporated under Sterling's cold, hard stare. He visibly shrank back. "This is between Mary and me," he blustered, his voice lacking conviction. "Anything that concerns my wife concerns me," John said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are on my land. You will state your business, and then you will leave." "I came for what's mine," Rafferty cried, a note of desperation creeping in. "That's my child she's carrying. She was my girl." "She is my wife," John stated, each word a hammer blow. "The child is a Sterling. You have no claim here. You have no rights here. You are nothing but a memory, and a poor one at that." Rafferty looked at Mary, his eyes pleading. "Mary, tell him. Tell him about us. Tell him he can't just buy you." All the pain, the humiliation, the lonely nights and backbreaking days, it all coalesced into a single point of cold, clear rage. "He didn't buy me," Mary said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. "He saved me. He saved me from you and from the life you condemned me to. This child," she said, placing a protective hand on her belly, "will never know your name. You are a ghost, Thomas. Now vanish." Rafferty stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. He had expected tears, recriminations, perhaps even a flicker of the old affection. He had not expected this iron-willed stranger. He looked from her cold, unforgiving face to the granite-like visage of her husband. He was beaten. "You'll regret this," he spat, his final pathetic attempt at defiance. "No," John Sterling said softly. "You will." He turned to the two ranch hands who had followed him from the house. "Escort this man to the edge of my property. See that he understands he is never to return." The cowboys, eager to obey, grabbed Rafferty by the arms. He didn't resist, his body going limp with defeat. As they dragged him away, he looked back at Mary one last time, his eyes full of a venomous hatred that chilled her to the bone. When he was gone, the silence that fell was profound. Mary stood trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving her weak and shaken. She had faced her past. She had won. But the victory felt hollow. She turned to her husband. "Thank you," she whispered. John was not looking at her. He was staring at the spot where Rafferty had stood, his expression dark and brooding. A muscle worked in his jaw. "He will be back," John said, not as a prediction, but as a certainty. Men like that, driven by pride and greed, they don't give up so easily. He finally turned to look at her, and for the first time, she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. It looked almost like fear, not for himself, but for her. "This changes nothing in our arrangement," he said, his voice suddenly harsh, the mask of indifference slamming back into place. "But you will not leave the ranch without me or Henshaw. You will not go anywhere alone. Is that understood?" "Yes," Mary said, her own voice barely audible. He turned and strode back towards the house without another word. Mary watched him go, a storm of new, terrifying questions swirling in her mind. His reaction had been more than that of a man protecting his property or his name. It had been personal. His fear, his anger, it was too intense, too immediate. Men like that, driven by pride and greed. He had spoken with the conviction of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. And as Mary walked back to the cold safety of the ranch house, a horrifying thought began to take root in her mind. John Sterling and Thomas Rafferty were not such different men after all. They were both men who took what they wanted, and she was caught between them. The confrontation with Thomas Rafferty shattered the fragile peace of the Sterling ranch. An unspoken tension now crackled in the air, thick and suffocating. John became even more remote, a thundercloud of a man who moved through his own home like a ghost. He was constantly watchful, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting an attack at any moment. He assigned 2 armed ranch hands to patrol the perimeter of the main house day and night, turning the gilded cage into a veritable fortress. Mary, for her part, felt a new kind of imprisonment. She was no longer just lonely. She was a protected asset, a piece of property to be guarded. John's order that she not leave the ranch alone was strictly enforced. Even her walks in the garden were shadowed by a cowboy lingering at a respectful but constant distance. The fear she had seen in her husband's eyes had now wrapped itself around her life. The foreman, Frank Henshaw, watched the new arrangements with a grim satisfaction. He saw it not as protection for Mary, but as a necessary precaution against the trouble she had brought to their door. His hostility remained, but it was now tinged with a grudging respect for the way she had dismissed Rafferty. He began to speak to her, not with warmth, but with a gruff civility, asking for her instructions on household supplies or relaying messages from John. It was a small shift, but in the suffocating silence of the ranch, it was significant. One evening, unable to bear the oppressive atmosphere of the house, Mary walked out onto the veranda. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. She saw John by the corral speaking with Henshaw. Their conversation was intense, their gestures sharp. As she watched, Henshaw shook his head vehemently and pointed back toward the house, towards her. John's response was to turn his back on the foreman and walk away, his shoulders stiff with anger. Later, when he came in for dinner, the silence between them was heavier than ever. Mary couldn't stand it anymore. "He doesn't want me here," she said, breaking the quiet. "Henshaw, he blames me for this." John didn't look up from his plate. "Frank Henshaw knows his place. He thinks I'm a danger to the ranch," she pressed on. "He's right, isn't he? As long as Thomas Rafferty is out there, I am a liability." "You are my wife," John said, his voice hard. "That is all that matters." "Is it?" Mary asked, her voice rising. "Or am I just the mother of the sterling heir, a vessel you're protecting until the product is delivered?" The words were cruel, born of her fear and frustration, but she couldn't take them back. John finally looked at her, and the raw pain in his eyes made her gasp. "Do you think you are the only one with a past you'd rather keep buried?" he asked, his voice low and guttural. "Do you think you are the first person to come to this valley seeking to escape a ghost?" He pushed his chair back and stood up, walking over to the fireplace. He stared into the flames, his broad back a wall of secrets. "My father built this ranch from nothing. He was a hard man. He bought this land, and he fought for it. When he died, he left it all to me. But he left me something else too, a legacy of his own making." He turned to face her, his face etched in shadow and light. "I had a sister. Her name was Elizabeth. She was beautiful, full of life. She fell in love with a man, a gambler, a charmer, with eyes the color of a summer sky and a voice full of promises." Mary's blood ran cold. "My father forbade the match," John continued, his voice heavy with memory. "He knew the man for what he was, a worthless drifter looking for a rich wife. But Elizabeth was headstrong. She believed his lies. She ran away with him. A few months later, my father got a letter. The man wanted $10,000. He said Elizabeth was pregnant and that if my father didn't pay, he would abandon her, leave her to face the shame alone." He paused, swallowing hard. "My father was a proud man. He refused. He told the man to go to hell. He said no child of that viper's blood would ever be a sterling." A week later, we found Elizabeth. She had walked for 2 days to get home. The ordeal had been too much for her. We lost them both, the baby and my sister. The silence in the room was absolute. Mary could hear nothing but the crackling of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. She finally understood. His fear, his obsession with protecting her, his strange, desperate proposal of marriage. It wasn't about an heir. It was about redemption, his own. "When I saw you," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "hauling that water, pregnant, alone, it was like seeing Elizabeth's ghost. I saw my father's mistake, and I swore I would not let it happen again. I couldn't save my sister, but I could save you." The truth of it, so much more complex and tragic than she could have ever imagined, washed over her. This loveless bargain, this cold contract, had been born from the deepest, most painful corner of his heart. It was an act of penance, an attempt to rewrite the most devastating chapter of his life. She stood up and walked towards him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She stopped a few feet away, seeing him not as the powerful rancher, the unreadable stranger, but as a man haunted by a grief so profound it had shaped his entire existence. "Your father was wrong," she said softly. "A child is not its father's sins. It's just a child." He looked at her, his blue eyes shimmering with an unshed emotion she now recognized as grief. "I know that now," he said. In that moment, the wall between them crumbled. The contract, the arrangement, the cold, hard terms of their marriage. They all dissolved in the face of this shared vulnerability. He was not just her protector, he was a fellow survivor, a person as scarred by the past as she was. She did not know what to do, what to say. So she did the only thing that felt right. She reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense, like coiled steel. He didn't pull away. He simply stood there, letting her touch him. And for the first time since she had arrived at the Sterling Ranch, the vast, lonely house felt, for just a moment, like a home. John's confession changed everything. The silence between them was now filled with a fragile understanding. He began to talk to her, to share the burdens of the ranch, and the empty space at the long dinner table between them vanished as he moved his chair next to hers. Mary, in turn, saw the man behind the fearsome rancher and found a quiet respect, a deep and terrifying trust beginning to grow in her heart. The threat, however, remained. It materialized one night as a hellish glow on the horizon. A barn in the north pasture was ablaze. "It's him," John said, his face grim as he grabbed a rifle. "He's trying to draw us out." He turned to Mary, his eyes intense. "Bar the doors. Don't open them for anyone." With a last raw look, he was gone into the chaos. Hours later, a frantic pounding came at the kitchen door. A voice claiming to be a young, injured ranch hand begged for entry. Against John's command and her own better judgment, Mary's compassion won out. The moment the bolt was thrown, the door burst open. Thomas Rafferty stood there, a triumphant sneer on his face, a knife to the housekeeper Carlotta's throat. "Your husband took something from me," Rafferty hissed, advancing on Mary after his men had tied up Carlotta. "Now I'm taking something from him, first the child, then the ranch." Just as he lunged, a searing, undeniable pain ripped through Mary. The baby was coming. Now as she collapsed, crying out, Rafferty's cruel smile faltered. But before he could react, the main door of the house splintered into fragments. John Sterling stood silhouetted against the fiery sky, a shotgun leveled at Rafferty's chest. "Get away from my wife," he said, his voice a low promise of death. Rafferty panicked, grabbing Mary to use as a shield. "Drop it, Sterling, or she dies." Another contraction tore a cry from Mary's lips, causing her to sag in Rafferty's grip. It was the only opening John needed. He fired. The blast was deafening. Rafferty screamed as the buckshot tore through his leg, and he collapsed to the floor. John didn't spare the man a glance, rushing to Mary's side. "The baby," she gasped. "It's coming." He lifted her into his arms and carried her to their room. Through the long hours of the night, he stayed by her side, his strength becoming hers. As dawn broke, their son was born, his healthy cry filling the room. Looking at the child in her arms and then at her husband, Mary saw the years of pain and grief wash away from John's face, replaced by pure wonder. He reached out and stroked the baby's cheek, a true, genuine smile transforming him. "He has his mother's grit," John said softly. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss not of duty, but of profound tenderness. It was a kiss that sealed not a bargain, but a bond forged in desperation, tested by fire, and cemented by the miracle of new life. She was home. Mary and John's journey began not with love, but with desperation. It was a contract signed in the dust, a bargain to save two broken souls and one innocent child. They faced down the ghosts of their pasts, the judgment of the world, and the very real threat of violence, discovering that the strongest bonds are often forged in the hottest fires. Their story reminds us that sometimes a family isn't something you're born into, but something you build through courage, sacrifice, and the choice to see the good in a flawed person. It's a story of how a house became a home and a bargain became a promise for a lifetime. If this story of survival, love, and redemption in the Old West moved you, Please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a dramatic tale, and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you for watching.